reporting tonight by the Washington Post says that the President of the United States and the Saudi royal family are not searching for the truth of what happened to Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. They are searching for a mutually agreeable explanation. That's their phrase. And it's not easy to find an explanation for why Jamal Khashoggi was seen entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul and was never seen leaving that Saudi consulate. In fact, it's not easy to answer a single question about it if what you're really trying to do is get to an agreeable explanation.
Did they say that Mr. Khashoggi is alive or dead?
I don't want to talk about any of the facts. They didn't want to either, in that they want to have the opportunity to complete this investigation in a thorough way.
Did you talk about repercussions in case the Saudis or funds be involved?
We talked about the importance of completing the investigation.
That is the sound of someone who's looking for an agreeable explanation, not someone who's looking for the truth. The Washington Post is reporting tonight the Trump administration and the Saudi royal family are searching for a mutually agreeable explanation for the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, one that will avoid implicating Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who is among the president's closest foreign allies, according to analysts and officials in multiple countries. Also tonight, the Washington Post published the final op-ed piece by Jamal Khashoggi, which was delivered to the paper by Khashoggi's translator the day after he disappeared. In the piece, Khashoggi says Arab governments have been given free rein to continue silencing the media at an increasing rate. The Arab world is facing its own version of an Iron Curtain. And today, the New York Times added more gruesome detail to what happened to Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate. The Times source for this report was an unnamed Turkish official who described an audio recording that allegedly recorded the sound of the murder and the dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. The Times report quotes, says, after he was shown into the office of the Saudi consul, the agents seized Mr. Khashoggi almost immediately and began to beat and torture him, eventually cutting off his fingers. The Saudi consul then said, quote, "Do this outside, you will put me in trouble." One of the killers replied, quote, "If you want to live when you come back to Arabia, shut up." And then the New York Times reporting turns much more gruesome. Quote, as they cut off Mr. Khashoggi's head and dismembered his body, a doctor of forensics who had been brought along for the dissection and disposal had some advice for the others, according to the senior Turkish official. Listen to music, he told them, as he put on headphones himself. That was what he did to ease the tension when doing such work, the official said. Here's what the president said today about the audio recording of the murder.
You asked for this audio, video intelligence that the Turks...
We have asked for it if it exists. We have asked for it. Yeah.
But you haven't got...
We've asked for it if it exists.
Are you surprised that they haven't turned it over? Or?
No, I'm not sure yet that it exists. Probably does, possibly does.
Tonight, the Washington Post is reporting U.S. intelligence officials said they had no reason to doubt that Turkey has an audio recording that shows what officials claim. The Post is also reporting that the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Republican Senator Bob Corker, is saying that the Trump administration had clamped down on sharing intelligence about the Khashoggi case. He said an intelligence briefing scheduled for Tuesday was canceled, and he was told no additional intelligence would be shared with the Senate for now, a move he called disappointing. Bob Corker told the Washington Post, quote, "I can only surmise that probably the intel is not painting a pretty picture as it relates to Saudi Arabia." Leading off our discussion now, Tim O'Brien, the executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion and the author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald. Also joining us is Richard Stengel, former Undersecretary of State, and Evelyn Farkas, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. All are MSNBC contributors. And Evelyn, let me start with you. It seems to me, as I listen to this administration, especially as I listen to the president, that the choice seems to be that either Donald Trump doesn't care about Saudis possibly murdering a journalist, or Donald Trump actually approves of Saudis murdering a journalist. I don't see any other option in what I hear him saying so far.
Well, Lawrence, I would say that he probably doesn't approve because if you remember when the story first broke, he did tell Leslie Stahl in the 60 Minutes interview that he found it horrendous and particularly horrendous if it was true that it was a murder of a journalist, right? So I don't think he approves, but I think you're onto something when you say he doesn't care. Because if he cared, he would understand very clearly the implications of this on a human level, certainly. I mean, we're talking about somebody who lived here as a permanent resident, who was a colleague of people that you and I know in Washington, D.C., and, of course, has family here living in the United States as well. I'm not sure if they're citizens or not, but I also think that's not relevant, although the president has made a bit of a beef about it. But I think the main point is that this president, you know, pulling back, he's the president. So regardless of whether he understands it as a human, we're talking about U.S. interests and leadership inside America. So, you know, the audience is the American people first and foremost, and then the world. And he doesn't understand that values have a value for the United States when we are essentially going out in the world conducting foreign policy. So it's not just money and arms sales and economic interests, military interests, but the values that America espouses, standing up for human rights. And in this case, something that was done so blatantly in our face, as Lindsey Graham said, you know, and then the lies that came afterwards. We as a country need to stand up for the international community and stand up for these principles for all the other people who are trying to speak out, all the journalists who are trying to do the right thing, all the dissidents around the world, and to really stiffen the spines of other Democrats and other countries and other leaders around the world, because that's what the United States does.
Rick Stengel, you worked in the State Department with Secretary of State John Kerry. Would he today have been saying, we didn't ask them any facts, we don't want to know any facts, we don't want to know any answers? What would we be hearing from the Secretary of State in the previous administration?
You'd get a very stern warning to the Saudis about this. We would be looking at all of the ranges of things that could have an effect on them, from arms control agreements. You'd be looking at something called the Global Magnitsky Act, which allows the President of the United States to sanction international human rights violators. The same way that we sanction the oligarchs in Russia, you'd be looking at the sanctioning of the princes and the royal family in Saudi Arabia. One of the things that's disturbing about the way that Donald Trump has reacted to this, and Saudi Arabia has been our ally since FDR met with King Saud in 1948. But we always tried to get them to move toward a more progressive direction. Even when we were selling arms to them, we'd say, you can't use it on your own people. You can't take the technology that we give you and use it on your own people. The Trump administration has a complete hands-off transactional approach. They say, here are the weapons, here's the technology, use them as you like. That's what's disturbing, and I agree with Evelyn that we need to kind of talk about human rights when we're dealing with our allies and our adversaries. Tim,
your headline today on your reporting in Bloomberg is, Trump and Kushner put Saudis' money first. How much does that explain what we're seeing?
I think it explains a lot of it. You know, this is freelancing on foreign policy coming home to roost. You cannot run a sophisticated foreign policy in the Middle East on the heels of Jared Kushner, who, through most of the period that he's been operating over there, he didn't have a full security clearance. He had very little diplomatic experience. But what he did have was a failing skyscraper on Fifth Avenue that his family was desperately trying to refinance. He had lobbied the Chinese for an investment during both the campaign and the transition period. He may have spoken to Russians. We still don't really, he denies it, but there's still some question about that. And we know that he spoke to at least one Saudi investor. And the president essentially let him lead this tilt towards Saudi Arabia. In a realpolitik sense, it's a bulwark against Iran. In terms of the Trump family's own finances, the Kushners and the Trumps, I think they saw it as a pure business opportunity. And everything that the president has said when he's pressed to explain why he doesn't want to just cleanly and clearly condemn the apparent murder of Khashoggi is he says that Saudi Arabia invests a lot of money in the United States and we have a big arms deal with them. And in fact, he's misrepresented the bona fides of the arms deal. He's overstated how much it's worth and when the money is going to arrive. But I think in the back of both of their minds, they see the Saudis as potential business partners.
And, you know, they've had a completely hands-off approach about the war in Yemen, where American weapons are being used to kill thousands and thousands of civilians. The UN released a report just yesterday that there's a famine among 10 million people in Yemen. So the American weapons that we are selling them, that the taxpayer is supporting, is being used for these basically terrorist purposes that the Trump is hands-off about. And that was something the Obama administration was very concerned about.
Evelyn, on the arms sales have been used in a variety of ways by American administrations, including to try to obtain better behavior from the regimes that we have sold arms to.
Right. I mean, Lawrence, it's one way that we actually have ongoing influence because they need our arms. This is the problem. The president also doesn't understand that the Saudis actually need us at this point more than we need them. We don't rely on them for oil as much as we did in the past. In fact, I think they're our second importer after Canada, if I'm correct on that. And in the arms deals, you're right. They they sign up to buy a bunch of arms, and they signed up to $110 billion, and under Obama, of course, it was 115, and some of those dollars are actually for the same programs. It doesn't matter. They don't spend as much, but what they do spend, we then get to watch. We make them sign agreements saying that they won't transfer any of the technology. We watch what they're doing. As Rich said, we have ongoing hardcore diplomacy with countries that use our weapons to ensure that they don't use them in ways we disagree with, because then we can sanction them and not provide spare parts that they need, not provide training and other things that they need.
Rick, you've had a one-on-one meeting with Mohammed bin Salman in your last year in the State Department. The two of you one-on-one for a couple of hours late at night. What do you know about him? What did you gain about him that could guide the way we watch what we're watching now?
Well, the meeting was at midnight, which is an early meeting in Saudi Arabia. They keep you waiting all day long and then meet you at midnight. And he's a very powerful, impressive figure. He's physically large. He talked about the openings that he was planning on doing, allowing women to drive, opening movie theaters. He talked about an issue that the U.S. government has been concerned about for decades, which is Saudi Wahhabi schools. They support Wahhabi schools all around the Muslim world. They give Qurans to that, and it's a very severe form of Islam that some people think is a reason for extremism. He talked about all those things. He talks a great game. The problem is he feels no impunity to what he can do. He's completely consolidated power. He doesn't report to anybody, and has an authoritarian tendency that nobody represses, and we've seen what the result of that is.
Tim, when Donald Trump has said publicly, the Saudis, they buy a lot of apartments from me. Of course I like the Saudis.
Right.
Is that pretty much all you have to know about Donald Trump and the Saudis?
No, it's not all you have to know. And in fact, I think it's ironic that he felt unprompted. He had to go on Twitter yesterday and say, I have no investments in Saudi Arabia, parenthetically, or in Russia either. And he's been playing this game for about a year in which he says, I don't have investments in these countries that people are concerned about. The reality is they have investments in him, oftentimes here in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things we're...
What do you mean by an investment in him?
Well, they're buying his condominiums.
Yeah.
He had Russian buyers for scores of his condominiums. He had partners of Russian descent on projects like the Trump Soho. The Saudi Arabian government bought the entire 45th floor of Trump World Tower in 2001. This goes far back in his history. Even prior to that, Al-Walid bin Talal bailed Trump out in the early 1990s when he almost went personally bankrupt, when a prominent Saudi sheikh bought his yacht and the Plaza Hotel from his banks when he couldn't afford to own them any longer. And I think one of the signals is, and the Saudi delegation, by the way, is one of the biggest clients of the Trump International Hotel in Washington. And the signal that this is sending to the world is that the President of the United States can be bought and sold. If you need to curry favor, or if you need to be able to run roughshod over your region, as long as you do business with the Trump administration and with the president personally, you can pretty much do whatever you want. I think it's a low point in U.S. foreign policy, and it's really unusual.
Evelyn, if this had happened in a previous administration where you didn't have the questions of how much does Donald Trump owe financially to Saudis, how much does the president involve financially with Saudis, and all of that was out of the picture, and we could expect an honest attempt by an administration, an American administration, to deal with this. It's still very difficult to deal with, isn't it, given the Saudi geopolitical position with the United States?
Yes, I mean, Lawrence, you still have to balance, right, the hard national interests with human rights and dealing with this kind of extraterritorial, extrajudicial killing. I think this did cross a line, again, as I mentioned, because the killing was conducted in a consulate in Turkey, and then they lied about it to the world, to us. You know, it does cross a line, which is not to excuse Yemen or any of the other terrible things they did. And I think, as you said, for any administration, it would be difficult. We have other allies and partners that we deal with. We deal with China, and they also have a bad human rights record, right? But we find a way to express our displeasure, to put pressure, at a minimum diplomatic. But in this case, absolutely, it has to be more than that. It has to be economic, because they lied. Frankly speaking, the Saudi kingdom needs to hold people accountable, up to the crown prince. I mean, if I were Pompeo, you know, I would have gone in there and given a very strong message from my president. You know, if it were a different president, he would have been saying, we need the facts now. First of all, where is this man? Is he alive? You know, et cetera, et cetera. So right now, all Pompeo did was Secretary Pompeo went there and said, well, the Fox is investigating what happened in the chicken coop. And then he flew over to Turkey, which is basically the farm where the chicken coop is, and seemed to dismiss. I mean, we haven't heard anything out of him about what he heard in Turkey. And we do know from one of the, I think it was the Washington Post account that Shane Harris wrote, that he didn't want to listen to the tape. I guess I wouldn't want to either. But really, the administration needs to tell the American people and certainly Congress what they know.
Evelyn Farkas, Rick Stengel, Tim O'Brien, thank you for starting our discussion tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.